Hello and welcome to this video on Thomas Egenes, Introduction to Sanskrit, Lesson 3. This is 3b, and we're starting here at page 24, where it starts the grammar. And as always, the written notes that I'm making on the iPad continue over from 3a, so the written notes for 3a and 3b will all be on the same document in my Google Drive. The grammar here introduces the present tense, parasmaipada, that's effectively the active voice of the verb, in the plural. And I will read through the plural persons for you, using the root gam, which, as you know, makes gacchati, gam, to go, the root go, the finite verb gacchati, he goes, and as always, I'll read them through in the Sanskrit order. That's the he, she, it first, then you, then I, we. So they go. Gacchanti, gacchanti, gacchata, gacchata, gacchamaha, gacchamaha. So now we have the complete conjugation for this verb. That's the present active, and I will recite it through slowly and try to follow it orally after me. I'll recite it in the order in which it's traditionally recited in India, that is, starting with what we call the third person singular, but in Sanskrit and Pali grammar it's called the first person, that's the he, and you go across the columns. You don't go down them as it go, I go, you go, he goes, and so on. You go, in Sanskrit, you do the he goes, then across to the dual, they do, the two of them, the two go, and then over to the plural, they plural go. And then to the Madhyama Purusha, what they call in Sanskrit, Madhyama Purusha. I was confusing Madhyama Nikaya and Pali, the middle-length sayings. Madhyama Purusha, the middle person, which is the you. And then across those persons, the you singular, you dual, you plural, and then finally the I, we two, and then we, all of us, that's three or more. So this now, you'll hear the complete forms for the present of the verb gam, as gacchati, gacchata, gachanti, gacchasi, gacchata, gacchata, gacchami, gacchava, gacchama. Now that we've got this conjugation all together, it will be convenient for you just to look at the various endings in comparison with one another. I will now share my screen and just write it out for you. There we are. In the traditional order. So, gacchati, gacchataha, and the plural, gachanti. Gachanti. Now, for those of you who know Latin, and indeed French, this NT together, which is characteristic of the they, what we call the third person plural. You have that same NT together in Latin and in French written, but mostly not pronounced as if it's an ENT. And in Italian, you find it, but the NT becomes NO, and in Spanish you find it, the verbs, the third person plural, just commonly ends in an N, not an NT, just the N, but it's that same N or NO or NT that reflects this Proto-Indo-European and that Sanskrit and Pali, anti, so gachanti. Now to the middle person, or what you call it the second person, singular, gachasi. The two of you go, gachata. And you, plural, go, the plural, three or more, gachata. Gachata. And for, we call the first person, I go, gachami. Same exactly there as in Sanskrit and Pali, as we say, the refuges in Pali, buddhang saranang gachami. In Sanskrit, almost identical, so you say sh instead of s, so buddhang sharanang gachami. Apart from the difference in the s and the sh, those are the phrases identical in Sanskrit. So in Sanskrit, buddhang sharanang gachami. And we go, that two of us, just do talk about yourself and one other person, is gachava. Gachava. And we, that's me plus at least two others, there's to be three people to be a plural in Sanskrit, is gachamaha. Gachamaha. So just spot here particular differences that occur right throughout the conjugation of the present tense, not only in this class of verbs, but in every other class, most other classes. That, for example, spot these things. Look at the you two, the two of you, gachata. Is it a th, a, and then subdotted h? The only difference from that to the plural is that in the plural, it ends just in a pure vowel, gachata, as opposed to gachataha. That's the difference there. Now, spot the difference between the second, between the dual, what we call the third person dual, that's they too, which is gachataha. That's the one that I'm ringing now, gachataha. And the only difference from that, and that's they two go, and the only difference from that and you two go, is that in they, the ta is not aspirated, gachataha, but you two go gachataha. So those three verbs I've just looked at, they can all sound a bit similar to the English here. Gachataha, gachataha, and gachata. But they note carefully those distinctions because they do make the difference between who you're talking about and how many people you're talking about. Note also that in the what we call the first person, the I, we, the a is always lengthened. So it's not gachami but gachami. It's not gachava but gachava. And it's not gachama, it's gachamaha. This is characteristic of the first person. So we look now over to there's a note at the bottom of page 24 saying students of Sanskrit in India memorize these conjugations horizontally. That means they start here and put an arrow and they go across gachati, gachataha, gachanti, and then to the next line gachasi, gachata, gachata. Then to the third line gachami, gachabaha, gachamaha. That's how they typically recite that, as opposed to, for example, we all learned in Latin well, people of a certain age all learned in Latin amo, amas, amat, amamus, amatis, amant, and so on, which is we're going down I, thou, you singular, he, she, it, we, you plural, they. It's just it was traditionally done like that in Latin, and that's how we learnt it. In Sanskrit, I'll typically follow this order when we're going through verbs. So he says, students in Europe and America have learned them vertically, as I just mentioned, the way we do it in Latin. It would be better to follow the system of India and memorize horizontally, both verbs and nouns, which is what I'll do. Now, over to page 25. What is done here in paragraph 3 is simply putting the endings on their own in isolation from the verb. You might say, well, what's the point in learning these endings separately from the verb? Well, there is a point, because when you get to verbs that are conjugated differently, you will find these same endings are there without the characteristic ah. There are 4 classes of verbs, classes 1, 4, 6, and 10, that have this characteristic ah, this ah that I'm ringing here. See, gachati, gachasi, and the lengthened gachami. But these endings, ti, si, mi, sorry, I'll go across, ti, tas, anti, si, tas, ta, mi, thus, mus. These are the same throughout all classes of verbs, but what is different is the way that the root modifies before joining that ending. Just to give you one example, the root ad, which is a second class verb. Ad means to eat. In fact, it's directly cognate with our word eat, ad, eat, and the Latin edere. So ad is a verb that actually joins the endings directly to the root. So, for example, I eat is not adami, not that. It's admi. And we too eat, you see, is adva. So these endings without this, what they call the thematic a, which applies only to 4 classes of verbs, are the same throughout the entire conjugation. So it's worth learning them in that form. Don't necessarily need to do it by heart immediately. It'll come into you soon enough. Just recognize them there. Now, going to grammatical terms, it gets slightly more complex here than I would have expected in lesson 3 of slowly progressing grammar, but not to worry, we'll go through this anyway. It said verbs can be classified, says Thomas Egenes at paragraph 4 on page 25. Verbs can be classified in 4 basic ways: tense/mood, voice, person, and number. This is similar to, but slightly different from, how verbs are classified in English, and here is a simplified overview. Now, there's one way he's put it here. I just sound a note of caution when he says that verbs can be classified in 4 basic ways. Be cautious of the language that is being used. I've already touched on the fact that there are several classes of verbs in Vedic Sanskrit and Pali. There are 10. Panini recognizes 10, and 10 is how it's done for Sanskrit. A couple of them are merged in Pali, so we're down to 7 identifiable classes in Pali. Don't let that detain you here. So those are the classes of verbs. For example, gam is with its present stem gach. That's a first class verb, and as I said, ad, where the endings are joined directly to, there's not adami but admi. That's a second class verb. And I won't go through them all now, but there are 10 classes of verbs. please don't be put off. You'll see certain patterns emerging. We'll go through them slowly and methodically, so hopefully as we go through, rather than going, you'll go, aha, yeah, now I see. So those are the classes of verbs. Egenes has expressed himself in a way that, as I say, I want you to be cautious about when he says verbs can be classified in 4 basic ways. He is not talking about the 10 classes of verb here. He's saying that wherever you have a finite verb, then that finite verb has got a tense or a mood, a voice, a person, and a number. What we mean by a finite verb, as opposed to an infinitive or a gerund or a verbal noun, something like that. Let's take a very simple example. The verb to smoke, and we can have a verbal noun, smoking, but smoking is bad for you. Now, smoking there is not a finite verb. It's treated as a noun, the act of smoking. We're about smoking as an activity that one does. So that, but if you say, he smokes 20 a day, now smokes there is the finite, because you aren't leaving the verb sort of dangling with no particular person or time. It's finite. He smokes 20 a day. Or in the past, he smoked 20 a day. Smokes and smoke, there's a finite verb because you're tying it to a particular person, something that he did, to a time, and to a voice that's active or passive. So that's all that's meant by a finite verb. So remember, he smokes 20 a day. Smokes as a finite verb is tied to a particular person doing a particular thing with a subject and verb, as opposed to a participle, like a smoking a gun, a noun, smoking is bad for you, or an infinitive, I like to smoke. That's all it means. So whenever you have a finite verb in Sanskrit, you can always say 4 things about it. And that's what he means here. Let's look at the verb now, gacchati, from the root gum. Now, looking at that root gum, what can you say about it? Okay, it's just, that's the root on its own. It doesn't indicate who is going, when he went, how many of them, and so on. It's just, it contains the idea, the notion of going. And this is the irreducible root, this gum. Now let's go to gacchati, from that stream, gacchati. Now, you can say 4 things about this gacchati. First of all, the tense. It's the present tense. He goes, is going. If it were the past tense, for example, the imperfect, it would be agamat. Let's do it. Gacchati, this ending with this present base, and the ending ati indicates present tense. That's the first thing you can say about it. The second is the voice. That's active, passive, middle. We'll deal more with these as we go along, but here the voice is active. The characteristic ati ending. If it were a middle, it would be ending in ate. Don't bother, we haven't quite come to that yet, but we can say, okay, this is present tense, active. Which person is it? First, second, or third? Okay, in English parlance, third person. Ati, he, she, or it is going. Third person. And the number, how many of them? 1, 2, or more than 2. That's singular, dual, plural. Here, okay, it is third person, English parlance, first person in Sanskrit, and it's singular, ati, just one. So that's all he means when he talks about classified in 4 basic ways. Basically, that he should be saying that if you see any finite verb, there are these 4 things that you can say about it. What tense, Past, present, future, imperative, optative, and so on, imperfect. That's what tense or mood. What voice? Voice is just an odd linguist's way of saying active or passive or middle. What person, first, second, or third person, and what number, singular, dual, or plural. That's what's meant here. Now, in the second paragraph, under paragraph 4 on page 29, Egenes is talking about tense and mood and says the tenses and modes, actually he should have said moods there, not modes, moods, are grouped together into the 10 lakara, or L sounds, because they're each abbreviated by Panini, with the word beginning with the letter L. Don't bother with that too much at the moment. This is more abstruse Paninian grammar. I'll just briefly take you through it, but then bother to learn this by heart unless you're particularly interested. As I mentioned in an earlier video, Panini devised a number of code words to abbreviate things, just as in mathematics. If you want to say the square root of 2, the square root of 2, just use a symbol like that, 2. So the square root of 2. Panini did the same thing by inventing made-up words that weren't part of the language, but are used. In fact, they deliberately look a bit outlandish so that they can't be mistaken for ordinary, genuine Sanskrit words. These weird words, lut and lut and lut and lung, that he invented as code words. So instead of, when he wanted to talk about the present indicative tense, he wouldn't say the present indicative tense. He would just describe it in abbreviated form in his grammar as lut, lut. And all of the various tenses, it's very clever, Panini, he devised them all. They all begin with an L, so the perfect tense he just calls lit. And the periphrastic future, lut. Don't bother what it means at the moment. And the simple periphrastic, simple future, lut. So all of the names of the tenses, he devised these weird monosyllables, all beginning with an L. So when he wanted to talk about them all together, when he's talking about tenses in general, he doesn't have to run through all 10 of them, doesn't have to run through all 10. He just talks about the lakara. Kara means a maker, literally means a maker, but when you add it to the name of a letter, it just means the letter L. So lakara, the L series, the letter L, refers to all of these 10 code words that he devised to indicate the tenses. Now we'll look at the voice. Sanskrit is upagraha. Voice is actually a word invented by Latin grammarians, and that's why it's come into English. When we talk about a voice, we talk about the active voice or the passive voice. There is also a middle voice, as in classical Greek, and Sanskrit has it as well. The difference between active, passive, and middle. If you say the mother is washing the baby, that's an active verb. The mother is doing something to the baby. The mother is washing the baby, or the mother is dressing the baby. Active with a subject, active verb, and a direct object. You can make that into a passive sentence. The baby is being dressed by its mother. The baby is dressed by its mother. That's passive. So you're doing something to another personal thing, or something is being done to that personal thing by the agent, by the doer. There's also the middle voice. So just when you say the mother is washing the baby is washed by the mother, and the same with dressing. If you have a wash, you're washing yourself. Sanskrit, same as classical Greek, will tend to use the middle voice. In other words, it's an action, but not directed towards an external thing, but done for or which has an effect on oneself. So you are getting dressed. That would be the middle voice in Sanskrit and classical Greek. You are having a wash. You aren't washing something else. You aren't being washed by somebody else. You are having a wash. It's something you're doing to and for yourself. So that would be the middle voice. Learn these two words, parasmaipada and atmanepada, because we're going to be using those quite a lot. Para is a word with several meanings, and one of them is other. And the dative of that is parasmai. This is the pronominal declension. That's why it ends in a smai, not in aya. You know the phrase, homage to that noble guru, tasmai Shri Gurave Namaha. Tasmai Shri Gurave Namaha. So parasmai means to or for another. And the word pada means, in this context, word, as in Dhammapada. In Sanskrit, Dharmapada, the word of the Dhamma. So parasmaipada means word for another, which is the Sanskrit way of saying the active voice. In other words, something you're doing to another personal thing. By contrast, the middle voice doing something for yourself is atmanepada. We know the word atman, atman meaning self. In the nominative singular, it becomes atma, but it's the stem ending in n. Atman is the stem. And the dative, which is the standard normal ending for the consonantal stem in the masculine and neuter singular, is atmane. So atmane means to or for oneself. So the atmanepada means the word for oneself. Parasmaipada, active, atmanepada, middle. We'll use the Sanskrit terms. Now, I mentioned the passive. The stem of the passive verbs is slightly different from the active and middle verbs. It just adds a y immediately after the root. We'll come to that in due course. But what I just want to tell you, the reason I'm mentioning that here, the passive, is that the passive and the middle verbs have the same set of endings. So there's only two sets of endings that you will be needing to learn, even though there are three voices. That's active, middle, and passive. So the parasmaipada, often translated as active verb, active voice. Atmanepada, often translated as middle voice, but remember that the atmanepada endings, which we haven't come to yet, but we will shortly, the atmanepada endings also apply to the passive verb. Okay, so in lesson 9 we'll learn the middle voice, that's the atmanepada, which takes the middle endings. Usually when the fruit of an action comes back to the agent, fruit here meaning of course result of the action, when the fruit of an action comes back to the agent, that's the atman, to the self, it's the atmanepada, the for oneself word. When the fruit or result of an action goes to another person, that's a para, that's the parasmaipada, the for another word, parasmaipada. It doesn't always work exactly like that. Sometimes you have words that to us look like pure active verbs, but they might take this atmanepada ending. You just learn them as they go along. Some do both. The distinction was quite carefully made in Vedic times and in the very early history of the language. But occasionally the form of the word departed from its earlier natural form, which is why you have these slight anomalies. In practice, they don't cause any difficulty, and you'll pick them up as you go along. So looking now to page 26, I'll run through this briefly. We've done most of it already now. So this summarizes, for the person, we've learnt the three persons, which is Purusha. Purusha means person in Sanskrit, and it's the same as used by grammarians to mean as in first person, second person, third person. So the Pratama Purusha, literally first person, Pratama first, is what we call the third person, he, she, it. The second, or Madhyama, means middle. It's cognate with the English medium and Latin in medio. So Madhyama, standing in the middle, medium, second. And Uttama, Uttama meaning I or we. It means furthest out or last. Uttama is actually cognate with our word utmost, most out, Uttama. And for number, there's the three numbers. The Eka, they're called Vachana. Vachana looks like the word voice. In fact, it does mean voice or words, slightly confusingly, but in Sanskrit grammar, when in English and Latin and Greek grammar, when we talk about the voice, we're talking about active or passive. When they talk about the Ekavachana, Dvivachana, and Bahuvachana, the Sanskrit grammarians, and Pali as well, are referring to what we call the numbers. In other words, is it singular, dual, or plural? So the Ekavachana, the one voice meaning the singular, dui meaning two, dui cognate with our English word two and the Latin duo. So dvivachana, the two voice, namely the dual number, and the bahu means many, bahuvachana, the many voice, in other words, the plural for three or more. Paragraph 5, page 26, each verb may be classified according to these categories. As I've mentioned, be cautious about the use of the word classifying the verb, because it can be confused with this classification into the 10 classes that I've mentioned. So basically, as I said, what it says, if you've got a finite verb, gacchati, there are these four things that can be said about it. Gacchati. There's present, active, third person, and singular. Now, he mentions here in paragraph 6 abbreviations called parsing codes. Just pres indic act, third person means present indicative active, third person singular. There is ordinary abbreviations. Those of you who have seen the annotated versions that I have done of various Sanskrit and Pali texts will note that I use even more abbreviated versions, which I'm actually going to call up for you now on the shared screen. Hopefully this is coming over to you now, where we use even shorter ones, use the table of abbreviations, MFM, and for whoever put the verbs, here we are. The person, we use 1, 2, 3, number SDP, singular, dual, plural, voice AMP, active, middle, passive, then the tense and the mood. So all of you who are working with my annotated texts should have a copy of this sheet that's found on my general resources sheet that you should all have. Right, I'll remove that now. And in paragraph 7, he gives examples. Okay, you can just see for yourselves what those are. We now come to the question of accent on page 27. And he talks here about the accent, the higher and lower tones, that's the swara. These are specifically categories of Vedic, and they relate to how Vedic is chanted. Now, by all means, learn it if you take an interest in Vedic. It's totally unnecessary for those of you who are learning to read the Buddha or even recite the Buddhist texts in Sanskrit, because these tones, by the time even of Panini, they had virtually disappeared from standard Sanskrit. And by the time things like standard Buddhist literature, like the Bodhicharyavatara and similar were written, they just entirely disappeared from use, and they'd been replaced by a stress accent. The stress accent means, where do you put the stress in a word? I'll just give you an example. For example, I didn't do it before. We look at photograph. You see, and photographer. So photograph, stress on the first syllable. Photograph. In photographer, stress is on the second syllable, and again. Photographic, stress on the third syllable. Secondary stress, the half stress on the first syllable now. It's not the photographic, photographic. So photograph, photographer, photographic. So this is the stress. Sanskrit moved away from the Vedic tones, the upper tone, the lower tone, and the moving tone, and went over to a system of simply stressed and unstressed. Interestingly enough, so did Greek. In the earliest forms of classical Greek, the different marks, different accents represented different tones, higher and lower and moving, as existed in Vedic. But as time went on, I don't know exactly when, but probably by the time of the New Testament, and certainly in modern Greek, the whole idea of tone has disappeared and no longer exists. So the distinction between words in Greek, where you mark the accent, is solely a difference in stress. Like, for instance, pote, and so pote in Greek means when, and pote with the stress and fine means never. Pote. The difference is in stress. In Sanskrit, the importance of stress is there, but it's quite light, and it's quite unimportant, almost unimportant. A couple of cases where I'll need to remind you about it. And it doesn't have any significance in the meaning. In English, different stress can change the what a word is. For example, insult. If you put the stress on the first syllable, insult, that's a noun. If you put it on the second syllable, insult, it's a verb. So it actually changes what the word is. Sanskrit is all much easier. It has very minimal significance, and it's quite light, and it doesn't seriously matter. But it's kind of natural. Sanskrit will flow naturally with a certain stress, which will be quite familiar to the native English speaker's ear. So we have here the line here, Agnimile Puru. I'm looking at page 27, and the first line there, a few lines down, the first line, the only line of Devanagari on that page, which is in fact the very first line of the Rig Veda. Agnimile Purohitam Yajnasya Devam Ritvijam. I haven't really got that right, I can't chant Vedic, but you hear the higher and lower tones. If you ignore the tones and pronounce that as if it were ordinary Sanskrit, you would tend to hear something much more recognizable as an Agnimile Purohitam Yajnasya Devam Ritvijam. If you got the stress wrong, it wouldn't sound that good, but it wouldn't be misleading. It wouldn't create a different word. And he goes on to say then, paragraph 2, oh yes, so in classical Sanskrit texts, the accents are not marked. They'd effectively fallen out of use by the time the classical language came to be written. And in most Sanskrit dictionaries, a mark is placed over the udatta, that's the raised term for Vedic words only. That's no words that are found in Vedic, even though they're also equally Sanskrit. And then Panini, even Panini does not give rules for the stress accent, which indicates that by Panini's time, where the stress fell was not important in the meaning of a word. If it were important in Panini, he would certainly not have ignored it. He ignored it in his grammar because it had fallen into disuse and was no longer significant. Or had a significance, of course, for the correct chanting of the Vedic hymns. Yes, there it's important. But for ordinary Sanskrit, the importance had gone by the time of Panini, and certainly by the time of the Buddha. In Pali has a kind of natural stress, but no tones, higher and lower tones of the type that we have in the Veda. And finally, on page 27, Egenes says, and I totally agree, the important rule for proper pronunciation is to maintain a clear distinction between the short and the long vowels. Now, going over to page 28, the vocabulary and then some exercises. So I'll run through these words with you. Na, not, and placed exactly before the verb, the same as you have in Latin. The non and na, of course, in Latin, non are cognate words. And in the Slavonic languages, nie znаю, I know, nie znаю in Russian, I don't know. That's the na goes before the verb. Now the root vad, go to the next page, root vad, meaning to say. So it is a first class verb that belongs to class 1, we write in Roman. So that means that I say, you already know now how to say I say vadami. And he, she, it says vadati. Incidentally, the verbal noun from this root vad is vada. You often find where you have a root that has an a followed by a single consonant. It often makes its verbal noun by lengthening the a to a and adding an a. So vad becomes vada. Vada therefore means saying as a verbal noun. And by extension, it means what you say about something, what you teach. So, Theravada, the Thera, the elders, Vada, the teaching. So the Theravada, the saying of the elders, that means the teaching of the elders, what the elders taught. Now the root sta, meaning to stand, and cognate with our English word stand, Latin stare, Slavonic and Russian stach. There's this sta throughout, the root meaning to stand. This is one of, it belongs in class 1, but it's a subclass of class 1 because you duplicate the first syllable. And if it's a long a, you duplicate it with an I. So sta duplicates the t, and then you add the ending. By the way, it's not tistami, but tishtami, because by the rules of Santi, if within the word an S is preceded by a vowel other than a or a, it becomes retroflex, standard across the board. So tishtami means I stand, and tishtati, he, she, it stands. Tishtati. And in Pali, you'll recognize it, many of you will recognize this, he stands as tishtati. It's by standard phonetic mutation. Tisht becomes tishtati. Sorry, I've written tishtati, my mistake, sorry. Tishtati. Note well, tishtati with a short a. And he says all vocabulary is given in the order of the Sanskrit alphabet. Right, and the order of the Sanskrit alphabet, of course, we've already learnt, and I'll give you separate lessons on how to look up words. It's all hopefully by now you already have seen. If you look at the order of the Sanskrit alphabet, there's a certain logical sequencing to it, which we lack in the Latin alphabet, which partly derives from Greek, but ultimately derives from the Hebrew alphabet, where this logical sequencing just seems to be all over the place, where A, B, C, D, E, F, G, Y, and even in Hebrew, Abgad, Hawa, and so on, Y. Whereas in Sanskrit, there's a beautiful sequential logic to it. Maybe it's no accident that Indians tend to be so good at computers. You see this lovely sequential logic. So as an additional rule, you'll need to know to do these exercises. As an additional rule, you need to know to do these exercises that if a member in a series has more than one word, such as nagachati, the cha usually comes after the first word. So what it means here is na gachati, he does not go. If you want to say and he does not go, you wouldn't say na gachati cha, you'd say na cha gachati. So you look at the group of words na gachati and put the cha after the first of them. So na cha gachati. So gachami na cha gachati, I go and she does not go. And says you may also see cha at the end of a clause less often. For example, gachami na gachati cha. That's a lot less common. It's far more natural to say na cha gachati. It's just put here for the sake of completeness, that you won't often see it. Note where you do see it. Now we will look at the exercises. Note in these exercises, I'm looking in particular now at the 8 sentences that are given under paragraph 5, that you'll see the sentences written first without sandhi, that's without the coalescing of the words as they join. It's first given without it, and then in brackets it's given with it, with the sandhi. In most of these cases here, they're the same. I mean, many words you can put one next to the other, and there's nothing that happens that makes it necessary to apply rules of sandhi, or the rule of sandhi is that there is no change, which is what will happen, for example, what will invariably happen if one word ends in a vowel and the next word begins with a consonant. There will be no sandhi there. There will be nothing to change. So in this first sentence, vadati nacha vadami. So we'll run through these one by one. I will read them out, and you just try to hear them, preferably if you can without looking at the page, just so you can train your ear to hearing it. So I'll read it out, you try and translate it for yourself, and then I'll explain it. So, vadati nacha vadami. Vadati nacha vadami. So, vadati, he, she, or it. The ati tells you it's the third person singular. He, she, or it says or speaks. Nacha vadami, and I don't speak. By the way, cha can sometimes also mean but. Just from context you can tell. So vadati nacha vadami would mean he's speaking, but I'm not speaking. In practice, if you were saying, well, he's talking, but I'm not, then you'd say it slightly differently. You'd say something like sa vadati sa, meaning he. If you just think he's speaking, you don't normally need to use the pronoun. It's obvious if it's obvious who you're talking about, you can leave out the pronoun. just as you can, for example, in Spanish and Italian. So he's speaking, está hablando, habla. But if you specifically want to emphasize, he's speaking, but I'm not speaking. Él habla, pero yo no hablo. He is speaking, but I am not speaking. You do the same kind of thing in Sanskrit and Pali. You'd use the pronouns mostly just to emphasize a distinction. So in Sanskrit, you'd tend to say sabadati, ahantu, I, however, navadami. Sabadati, ahantu, navadami. But for the moment, that's a little bit more. We'll come to that soon. At the moment, for now, we'll just stick to how it's put in the exercises. So, and no change. There's no sandhi change to be made in that sentence because these are all words that end in a vowel. Vadati, na, cha, vadami. So where there might be a sandhi, there is none because it ends in a vowel. The next word begins in a consonant. Now, sentence B. Vadata smaratacha. Vadata smaratacha. Now, I've read it there without the sandhi. Here you do apply sandhi, because where you get a word ending in a visarga, that's what we have, the subdotted H. That in older forms of the language used to be words ending in an S, which have in Greek and Latin, that S is retained, typically in the masculine nominative singular. It became a subdotted H, smaratah. But if it occurs before a palatal, a ch or a ch, it changes it to a sh. So, vadata smaratascha. By sandhi, it's the same word, but by the final subdotted H, the final visarga, is changed to ashcha, ashcha. So vadata smaratascha. What does that mean? Look at vadata. The ending is written in Roman THA subdotted H. What does that tell you? It tells you it's the U2, it's the second person, the U dual form, THA subdotted H. U2 say smaratascha. Now, the ending ta, unaspirated T, ta, means they two, the two of them. So, vadata, you two say, smaratascha, and they, that is, they two remember. C, very simple, nagachanti. Nagachanti, you can tell by the ending anti there, it's the third person plural, so they, three or more, nagachanti, they do not go, they are not going. By the way, Sanskrit and Pali have no distinction between the general present and the present continuous, so they go, they are going. That distinction is not made in Sanskrit and Pali. Indeed, it's not made in most languages. Just English is one of that does. Italian and Spanish also do, but we're in a minority there. Sentence D. Tishtama gachamacha. That's without sandhi. Tishtama gachamacha. Now, the way I've read that, it's written like that just to give you the words in their raw form, but in a running text, it would be wrong to put them like that. It becomes tishtamo gachamascha. Tishtamo gachamascha. That is because this final before a voiced consonant, which is g, voiced, supposed to g, unvoiced, g, voiced, becomes an o. So tishtamo gachamascha, and gachamascha, as I've just explained, the cha becomes ashcha. So tishtamo gachamascha. That means We stand and we go. Tishtamo gacchamascha. That's the we, plural we, third person. By the way, this to o, the word namah, and sometimes it just means homage, greeting. Often in Sanskrit, when they're saying greeting, they'll say the word repeated. They'll just say, they won't say namah, namah, namah. They'll say namo namaha. Why? Because the of the namah becomes an o before the next word, which begins with a voiced consonant, with an N. So that's why it becomes not namah, namah, but namo namaha. Namo namaha. And just as the visarga, this subdotted H, becomes a sh before a ch or a ch, so it becomes an ordinary S before a t, which is why we have we don't say namaste, it becomes namaste. So by santi, before T, namah becomes namas. Namaste, as the greeting we'll know. Namaste, homage to thee. Now to sentence E. Without santi first. Bhavatascha, vasatascha, vasatascha. So I accidentally slipped into the correct santi when I meant to make a mistake. Bhavatascha, vasatascha. And read now with correct santi. Bhavatascha, vasatascha. Bhavatascha, vasatascha. And the meaning? Well, which person and number? The aspirated th, a subdotted h, the taha ending indicates second person dual, the two of you. Bhavatascha, vasatascha. You are and you dwell. You both are and you dwell. You exist and you dwell. Bhavatascha, vasatascha. F. Kutra bhavasi. No sandhi here. Verb ends, the word kutra ends in a vowel. Next word begins in a consonant. No change to be made. Kutra bhavasi. Bhavasi, that si is characteristic of the second person, Sanskrit, Madhyama Purusha, the middle person, you, singular. Kutra bhavasi, where are you? Wherefore art thou? Kutra bhavasi. Sentence G. Tishtanti gachanti cha. Tishtanti gachanti cha. No sandhi to be applied here. So tishtanti, they stand. Gachanti cha, and they go. Tishtanti gachanti cha. Sentence H. Nacha prichati, nacha vadati. Nacha prichati, nacha vadati. Again, no sandhi to be applied. With two occurrences of cha, it can mean, it tends to be more emphatic than with one. So, naprichati, he does not ask. Navadati, he does not say. You could say naprichati, nachavadati. He does not ask, and he does not say, he does not speak. But if you repeat the cha, it tends to have a slightly more emphatic effect, as we might say in English. For example, he neither asks nor speaks. Nacha prichati, nacha vadati. Nacha prichati, nacha vadati. Right, we'll now finally move on to paragraph 6, which is the English to Sanskrit translation exercises. So to paragraph 6 now, that's English into Sanskrit. I'll read it in English first, and then we'll put it into Sanskrit. So 6a, where are they going? So they are going, gachanti, where, kutra, so where are they going? Kutra gachanti. We do not speak. We speak is vadamaha. We do not speak is na vadamaha. I'll just write these out for you. Can't make the page go. Here we are. So where are they going? 6a is sorry. Kutra gachanti. We do not speak is na vadamaha. Na vadamaha. He asks, and they speak. You can say this in two ways, either with or without a repetition of the cha. Prichati vadanti cha, or prichati cha vadanti cha. Prichati, and I put the cha in brackets to show it's optional. Prichati cha vadanti cha. D, where are we standing? So root for stand is sta. It's a reduplicating verb, so we are standing, he is standing is tishtati, we are standing tishtami, sorry, tishtama, we are standing. So where are we standing? Kutra tishtama. Kutra tishtamaha. Where do those two live? Those two, now it has to be dual, so that's going to have the ta, unaspirated ta ending, that's written as a T, A, subdotted H. Vasataha, they live, they too live, so kutra vasataha, where do they live? Kutra vasataha. We are not going. We are going, gam gachati, we are going, gachamaha. We are not going, na gachamaha. Na gachamaha. I ask, and they remember. So, prichami smaranti cha. Prichami smaranti cha. Prichami smaranti cha. And finally, where are we? So root bhu, he is bhavati, we are bhavamaha. Where are we? Kutra bhavamaha. Kutra bhavamaha. Kutra bhavamaha. So that concludes the exercises in lesson 3. There is a summary sheet on page 30 that just summarizes the forms and words that we've had so far. Rather than read out translations of them, I will just read out all of the Sanskrit words on that sheet and just try to follow by listening. And for the verbs, for the one verb is given, one fully conjugated verb, I'll read that in the Sanskrit order, that's as it were across the columns. Gacchati, gacchataha, gachanti, gacchasi, gacchataha, gacchata, gacchami, gacchava, gacchamaha. And the verbs gam, gacchati, I'll say the root, then the third singular, gam, gacchati, prach, prichati, bhu, bhavati, vad, vadati, vas, vasati, stha, tishtati, smr, smarati. And 3 indeclinables, kutra, cha, na. Right, this concludes lesson 3 now, and I will see you again for lesson 4.